Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to read a couple of chapters from my translation of the Gita and preface it with a little setting of the poem in its context. Many of you may know its context, but for those of you who don't, it takes place on a battlefield. It's a battle that's going to decide the fate of an ancient northern Indian kingdom. And the leader of one of the armies, Arjuna, turns to his charioteer just before the battle begins and asks him to drive him to the place in between the two armies. Krishna turns out to be God incarnate, but Arjuna isn't aware of this quite as yet. And so they drive to that space, and Arjuna surveys the armies made up of his friends and relatives and teachers, dear people, many of them, and is suddenly overwhelmed with a sense of great pity and sorrow at the impending death of so many good men, and drops his weapons and says, I can't do it, I won't fight. And Krishna begins this, what's called in the text of the Gita, this wondrous dialogue. It's really a monologue, but it's as if time stops. The whole moving picture of this great epic suddenly is focused on a single frame, and the warriors are frozen in place, and the birds are frozen in place, and everything stops, and there's just the two consciousnesses engaged in a life and death discussion about deathlessness and the right way to live and love and devotion and what lies at the heart of our being. And the battle has long since faded as we listen to these extremely earnest voices talking about the most essential truths that each of us, whether we know it or not, is hungry for. So let me read first from chapter 9, which is actually where I started in the process of translation, because I love it so much. The secret of life. The blessed Lord said, because you trust me, Arjuna, I will tell you what wisdom is, the secret of life. Know it and be free of suffering forever. This is the supreme wisdom, the knowing beyond all knowing, experienced directly, in a flash, eternal, and a joy to practice. Those who are without faith in my teaching cannot attain me. They endlessly return to this world, shuttling from death to death. I permeate all the universe in my unmanifest form. All beings exist within me, yet I am so inconceivably vast, so beyond existence, that though they are brought forth and sustained by my limitless power, I am not confined within them. Just as the all-moving wind, wherever it goes, always remains in the vastness of space, all beings remain within me. They are gathered back into my womb at the end of the cosmic cycle, 150,000 billion of your earthly years. And as a new cycle begins, I send them forth once again, pouring from my abundance the myriad forms of light. These actions do not bind me, Arjuna. I stand apart from them all, indifferent to their outcome, unattached, serene. Under my guidance, nature brings forth all beings, all things animate or inanimate, and sets the whole universe in motion. The truly wise, Arjuna, who dive deep into themselves, fearless, one-pointed, know me as the inexhaustible source. Always chanting my praise, steadfast in their devotion, they make their lives an unending hymn to my endless love. Others on the path of knowledge know me as the many, the one. Behind the faces of 1,000,000 gods, they can see my face. I am the ritual and the worship, the medicine and the mantra, the butter burnt in the fire, and I am the flames that consume it. I am the father of the universe and its mother, essence and goal of all knowledge, the refiner, the sacred Om, and the threefold Vedas. I am the beginning and the end, origin and dissolution, refuge, home, true lover, womb, and imperishable seed. I am the heat of the sun. I hold back the rain and release it. I am death and the deathless, and all that is or is not. To those who meditate on me undistracted and worship me everywhere, always, I will bring a reward that never can be lost. Arjuna, all those who worship other gods with deep faith are really worshiping me, even if they don't know it. For I am the only object and the only enjoyer of worship, and they fall back because they cannot know me as I truly am. Worshipping the gods, men go to the gods. Worshipping spirits, to the spirits. Worshipping me, they come to me in the end. Any offering, a leaf, a flower or fruit, a cup of water, I will accept it if given with a loving heart. Whatever you do, Arjuna, do it as an offering to me. Whatever you say or eat or pray or enjoy or suffer. In this way you will be freed from all the results of your actions, good or harmful. Unfettered, untroubled, you will come to me. I am the same to all beings. I favor none and reject none. But those who worship me live within me, and I live in them. Even the heartless criminal, if he loves me with all his heart, will certainly grow into sainthood as he moves toward me on this path. Quickly that man becomes pure. His heart finds eternal peace. Arjuna, no one who truly loves me will ever be lost. All those who love and trust me, even the lowest of the low, prostitutes, beggars, slaves, will attain the ultimate goal. How much easier then for ordinary people or for those with pure hearts. In this sad, vanishing world, turn to me and find freedom. Concentrate your mind on me. Fill your heart with my presence. Love me, serve me, worship me, and you will attain me at last. And in the course of the Gita, it becomes very clear that the me, the I that Krishna is talking about, isn't anywhere outside, but is centered in the heart of every being. So when he says worship me and honor me, it's really, the sense is really more like connection and realization of who each of us already is. Chapter 11 is probably the most famous chapter in the Gita, and is the great, magnificent theophany. It entered American history in 1945 at Alamogordo, New Mexico, when Robert Oppenheimer witnessed the explosion of the first atomic bomb. And a verse from the Gita arose in his mind, which goes, brighter than 1,000 suns. And another verse arose in his mind, which is one of Krishna's descriptions of himself. I am death, annihilator of worlds. These references I think are uncannily appropriate, and I don't know where else in the whole literature of the world they might have come from to describe such a momentous experience. So, chapter 11, the cosmic vision. Arjuna said, graciously, Lord, you have spoken about the ultimate secret revealed when one knows the self, and your words have cleared up my confusion. You have told me in detail the origin and dissolution of all things, and have described your own vast, imperishable being. I do not doubt that you are what you say you are, Lord, And yet I want to see for myself the splendor of your ultimate form. If you think I am strong enough, worthy enough to endure it, grant me now, Lord, a vision of your vast, imperishable self. The blessed Lord said, "Look, Arjuna, thousands, millions of my divine forms, beings of all kinds and sizes, of every color and shape. Look, the sun gods, the gods of fire, dawn, sky, wind, storm, wonders that no mortal has ever beheld. Look, look, Arjuna. The whole universe, all things animate or inanimate, are gathered here. Look, enfolded inside my infinite body. But since you are not able to see me with mortal eyes, I will grant you divine sight. Look, look, the depths of my power." And here is the voice of the poet. I've printed this voice in italics to differentiate it. After he had spoken these words, Krishna, the great Lord of Yoga, revealed to Arjuna his majestic, transcendent, limitless form. With innumerable mouths and eyes, faces too marvelous to stare at, dazzling ornaments, innumerable weapons uplifted, flaming, crowned with fire, wrapped in pure light with celestial fragrance, he stood forth as the infinite God composed of all wonders. If 1,000 suns were to rise and stand in the noon sky blazing, such brilliance would be like the fierce brilliance of that mighty self. Arjuna saw the whole universe enfolded with its countless billions of life forms gathered together in the body of the God of gods. Trembling with awe, his blood chilled, the hair standing up on his flesh, he bowed and, joining his palms, spoke these words to the Lord. Arjuna said, "I see all gods in your body and multitudes of beings, Lord, and Brahma on his lotus throne and the seers and the shining angels. I see you everywhere with billions of arms, eyes, bellies, faces, without end, middle, or beginning, your body, the whole universe, Lord. Crown bearing mace and discus, you dazzle my vision, blazing in the measureless, massive sun flame splendor of your radiant form. You are the deathless, the utmost goal of all knowledge, the world's base, the guardian of the eternal law, the primordial person. I see you beginningless, endless, infinite in power, with 1 billion arms, the sun and moon your eyeballs, the flames of your mouth lighting the whole universe with splendor. You alone fill all space, and the 3 worlds shudder when they see your astounding, terrifying form. Multitudes of gods approach you, palms joined in dread and wonder. Multitudes of sages chant to you hymns of deep adoration. The storm gods, the gods of light, of sky, dawn, and wind, the angels, the saints, the demigods, and demons, all gaze at you in amazement. Your stupendous form, your billions of eyes, limbs, bellies, mouths, dreadful fangs, seeing them the worlds tremble, and so do I. As you touch the sky, many-hued, gape-mouthed, your huge eyes blazing, my innards tremble, my breath stops, my bones turn to jelly. Seeing your billion-fanged mouths blaze like the fires of doomsday, I faint, I stagger, I despair. Have mercy on me, Lord Vishnu. All Dhritarashtra's men and all these multitudes of kings, Bhishma, Drona, Karna, with all our warriors behind them, are rushing headlong into your hideous, gaping, knife-fanged jaws. I see them with skulls crushed, their raw flesh stuck to your teeth. As the rivers in many torrents rush toward the ocean, all these warriors are pouring down into your blazing mouths. As moths rush into a flame and are burnt in an instant, all beings plunge down your gullet and instantly are consumed. You gulp down all worlds, everywhere swallowing them in your flames, and your rays, Lord Vishnu, fill all the universe with dreadful brilliance. Who are you in this terrifying form? Have mercy, Lord. Grant me even a glimmer of understanding to prop up my staggering mind. The blessed Lord said, I am death, shatterer of worlds. annihilating all things. With or without you, these warriors and their facing armies will die. Therefore stand up, win glory, conquer the enemy, rule. Already I have struck them down. You are just my instrument, Arjuna. Drona, Bhishma, Jayadratha, Karna, and the other great heroes have already been killed by me. Fight, without hesitation, kill them. Having heard Krishna's speech, Arjuna, his palms joined, shivering with terror, bowed to the Lord deeply and stammered these words. Arjuna said, "Now I know why the universe delights and rejoices in you. Terrified, the demons scatter before you, and the sages bow. Why should they not bow, eternal Creator, infinite Lord? You are both being and non-being, and what is beyond them both? The primal God, the primordial person, the ultimate place of the universe, the knower and the known, the presence that fills all things. You are wind, death, fire, the moon, the Lord of life, the great ancestor of all things. 1,000 times I bow in front of you, Lord. Again and again I bow to you from all sides, in every direction. Majesty, infinite in power, you pervade. No, you are all things. If thinking you a human, I ever touched you or patted your back, or called you dear fellow or friend through negligence or affection, or greeted you with disrespect thoughtlessly when we were playing or resting alone or in public, I beg you to forgive me, immeasurable God, great Father of the world, teacher, sustainer, goal of all reverence, unique and peerless Lord of unthinkable splendor. Therefore, most sincerely, I beg your pardon. As a father forgives his son, a friend his dear friend, a lover his beloved, forgive me. Having seen what no mortal has seen, I am joyful, yet I quiver with dread. Show me your other form. Please, the one that I know, have mercy. Let me see you as you were before, crowned, bearing mace and discus, with only 4 arms, O billion-armed Lord of infinite forms. The blessed Lord said, "Graciously, for your sake, Arjuna, I showed you my highest form, dazzling, infinite, primal, which no one has seen but you. Not by worship or study or alms or ascetic practice can I be seen in this form by anyone but you, Arjuna. Do not be frightened or confused at seeing my horrific form. Free of fear, light-hearted, see me as I was before." Having spoken thus to Arjuna, the Lord stood before him again in the mild and pleasant form of Krishna, the kind, the beautiful. Arjuna said, "Seeing your human form, Krishna, I feel at ease. Once more I am myself, and my mind has regained its composure." The blessed Lord said, "The vision that you have been granted is difficult to attain. Even the gods are always longing to behold me like this. Not by study or rites or alms or ascetic practice can I be seen in this cosmic form as you have just seen me. Only by single-minded devotion can I be known as I truly am, Arjuna. Can I be seen and entered. He who acts for my sake, loving me, free of attachment, with benevolence toward all beings, will come to me in the end." Quite a chapter, I think. If anybody has a question about the Gita or about the translation or about the Tao Te Ching or any other topic that I may have touched on in my books, I'd be very glad to try to answer. I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Is it possible to read several paragraphs in the original language?
It is possible, but it's not possible for me. My Sanskrit is pretty rudimentary, and I had the good fortune of having excellent help, not people, but books, a couple of books. There's a wonderful literal and analytical version by Winthrop Sargent, who was the music critic for the New York Times for a long time, and Sanskrit was his hobby. And then there's a wonderful, meticulous scholarly commentary which goes through every line and every concept and every difficult word, and that was of great help as well. But my Sanskrit is, let's say, let's not say non-existent, but let's say existent enough for me to hear the music and shaky enough for me to need a lot of help.
Rooted within Hinduism. Can you explain Lord Krishna's idea of duty versus nonviolence?
That's a very interesting question. Krishna's advice to Arjuna on the field of battle, when boiled down to its, let's say, its literal and surface content is, don't be such a crybaby. Stand up like a man, go into battle, it's your duty, you're a warrior, this is what you should do. And at some greater depth in the chapter that I just read, there is no such thing as life and death. These warriors have already been killed, I've killed them, you're just my instrument, so go in and hack their heads off, basically. And this advice has troubled many modern readers, and rightfully so. Because what becomes of nonviolence then? What becomes of a lot of other things that Krishna says in the Gita? Gandhi wrote a wonderful essay on the Gita that I've included here as an afterword. Gandhi thought of the Gita as his spiritual mother and would read it daily, and I don't know if there's anyone who's ever had greater reverence for it than he. And yet his point of view was not a literal one. He was not a fundamentalist reader of the Gita. He felt that it was a great poem, and that in certain parts of it, this part in particular, Krishna's literal advice, it was very culture-bound. It came out of an extremely male-oriented warrior culture, and that insight, even from a great poet, is capable of maturing and evolving over the centuries as cultures evolve. And Gandhi quite rightly points out that the center of gravity in the Gita is non-attachment. The central lesson is you're entitled to your work, but not to the fruit of your work. In other words, as the Tao Te Ching says, do your work, then step back, the only path to serenity. So if you think about, if you're in any way attached to how other people react to what you do or who you are, then you're on very shaky ground. And if you know what is your business and what is God's business and your neighbor's business, then you're on very firm ground. Seeing it this way, Gandhi would say that Krishna's advice to Arjuna throughout the body of the poem and his portrait of the sage throughout the body of the poem is in direct contradiction to the advice, go in and fight, because it's impossible for someone who has matured to a certain level of transparency, let's say, someone who sees every being in the universe as a reflection of himself or herself, and who sees him or herself within God, there being no difference between any being, from the ultimate to the smallest, weakest creature in the world. Someone with this depth of insight is incapable of harming another being. It's unthinkable. It's just as impossible as harming himself. And so ahimsa, nonviolence, is not, at that point in a person's life, is not a directive coming from the outside. It's not a law that they're obeying, but it's as natural as breathing. There's nothing else that person can do from that point of view. And I think Gandhi is absolutely correct in his view that a sage, the beloved and passionately portrayed figure of the Gita, could not possibly enter a battle or or harm an animal. That said, there's another perspective as well, and you can take the perspective of Gandhi that war is never defensible, even a quote-unquote just war, as we have here in the Gita, according to the Gita. It's the war of good men against evil. But there's another point of view, and I can conceive of even a Buddha enlisting in World War II, in the war against Hitler. From my perspective, the most mature statement of how someone in harmony with the way things are enters a situation of violence or of conflict comes in a chapter of the Tao Te Ching that I have quoted in the notes to here. And that is such a balanced and wonderfully compassionate view that I if you're interested, I urge you to read it. Yes?
I'd like to ask about your approach to various texts and the different languages, the original language. I assume that you have probably different level of familiarity with different languages. For example, I've read your translations of Rilke and compared them to the German, which makes me think that you must have quite a command of German. Is that true? And could you just explain how, are there certain texts that you said, I want to translate that, whether I've ever seen the language, and then you go work to learn a certain level of the language?
Thank you for the question. Actually, my German is okay, but not terrific. And I recently was in Germany for the first time the past summer, and it turns out that I don't know how to order breakfast in a restaurant or ask the way to the bathroom, because that's not Rilke's German. I never learned those words. In fact, my experience has always been that I've never been interested in learning a language for the sake of becoming an expert or even for the sake of speaking. What happens with me is that I fall in love with a consciousness, and then I learn the language to become intimate with it. The first time that happened was with Rilke. I was in Paris. My girlfriend gave me Letters to a Young Poet in French, and I just was astonished, just staggered by the depth of this voice. And when I got back to America, I learned German so I could read the poetry in the original. And then the next one was the Book of Job, which I felt magnetically attracted to. Actually, after I broke up with this woman who gave me Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet 2 years later. Bless her heart. I felt that there was a deep, genuine insight into human suffering and the way beyond suffering at the end of the Book of Job in the Voice from the Whirlwind. I felt here was a man who had seen through into a place of radical peace. And I felt that if I could somehow understand that, I would be able to deal with the pain in my own heart. And so I learned Hebrew, and I learned textual scholarship, and brushed up my Greek, and a whole bunch of things that I had no idea I'd have to learn when I first got committed to the process. And at the end of 6 years, I discovered that I wasn't understanding anything at all, and that I'd have to meet it in the flesh. And so, to make a long story short, I was on my way to India when I bumped into a Zen master and saw the answer in his eyes and stayed with him, and then after intense practice had my experience. But it would keep happening like that. Spanish with Neruda, it was always falling in love and always wanting to, like falling in love with a person, wanting to enter a space of deeper and deeper intimacy and wanting to sink into that closeness that the process of translation makes necessary. And I always learned just enough to feel that I was doing it with a sense of integrity. Let me say almost always, because with the Tao Te Ching I never did learn Chinese, and I felt what I used to call an umbilical connection with that book that allowed me to proceed without that.
I was amazed that that 1/4 of your work too are dealing with biblical literature, which is our Western heritage. But then at the same time, you have your interest in Eastern spirituality, which is probably more non-dualistic in terms of its philosophy. I mean, how would you reconcile the two? Whereas in the Western tradition we have a greater sense of good and evil, whereas on the other hand, in the Eastern tradition, it's all much more integrated. So I mean, I just
Yes.
yeah.
I feel toward Judaism, and especially toward Zen Buddhism, as I feel toward my mother and father. I grew up as an adult in the Zen tradition, but I grew up as a Jew and still am. And so where I gravitated within the Jewish tradition is to the points of greatest clarity and depth, in my opinion. From what I said before, you can probably understand that the book of Job was my path into spiritual practice, and I'm enormously grateful to it. And I still believe, it's my experience, that the poet who wrote the book of Job was coming from a place of very deep awakened experience. That's what gives it its parallels to the Gita, to the theophany that I just read in the Gita, and its parallels to a lot of other texts that have a vision of God way beyond human moral categories. And it's maybe the most dramatic, or certainly along with the Gita, the most dramatic vision of this God that is pure electric energy and is closer in a sense to animal presence than to the human mind. It's a magnificent, wonderfully powerful and clear text. And I think that it's been honored, maybe in the history of its whole history, it's been honored most deeply by Blake's drawings for it. And Blake was somebody who had sometimes a great radar vision himself. So there's that place, there's the book of Job, there's the verses from the Gospels that I consider authentic. I consider Jesus an awakened teacher with a particularly Jewish passion for righteousness that just shines with great moral beauty. And his authentic teaching can be placed alongside the great masters from many traditions, and I think he would have been considered a brother by them. So there's that point in the high point in the Jewish tradition. The third highest point in my experience is Spinoza, who's usually not even considered as within that tradition, but he's a very, very clear and powerful presence beyond rational thought, I think. And then other texts that I've worked with are Psalms, where the devotional quality of the verse in many of the Psalms, I've only translated, it's not even a translation, it's a very free version of some of them, 50 of them out of 150. The quality of that wholehearted surrender to God, I think, is worthy of being seen alongside the Gita, another great devotional work. Genesis is a different matter. I've done a version of Genesis, and there, what I was deeply attracted to were stories that have such pregnant, creative vision to them and are so deeply ingrained in our Western consciousness that they're almost a language. It's almost like an alphabet of the soul. And I felt that it would be a very valuable experience to inhabit each of these stories and get close to the rock and ground and water quality of the Hebrew prose. It's very wonderful, striking prose, and to somehow, even with the stories that I didn't particularly care for or that I felt were being written at a more superficial level, I felt it would be valuable for me to just inhabit them. And out of that has come all sorts of wonderful experiences, and I feel that they are indeed as powerful metaphors, as stories, as powerful as any, maybe even more powerful than any of the Eastern texts. Of course, their clarity of vision, their depth of understanding is nowhere near the depth of the Gita or the Tao Te Ching, but that's not what we read them for, I think. Yes?
In doing the right translation, what is your concept of faithful to the original? If, like you said, on certain occasions you don't have complete mastery of the original language.
That's an interesting question. My concept of faithful. If I had to boil it down to one sentence, I would quote Samuel Johnson, who said, the true test of any translation is, these are not his exact words, but more or less, the true test of a translation is how it reads as an English poem. And of course, within that, you can have a wonderful poem that completely trashes the original and an awful poem that is extremely faithful to the original. What I'm drawn to in these great sacred texts or great poetry like Rilke is a music in which intricacy and subtlety of content is part, and clarity and depth of vision is part too, but all of these are reflected in the music, in the dignity and the beauty of the verse. And so what I feel that my job is to somehow enter that state of intimacy with the original text, the consciousness that wrote the text. Sink down into the best, this is the best that I can say it, sink down into a space beneath the words and then re-emerge into English with the equivalent of that consciousness and be able to recreate something like the music. It can't be the music because the language is different, and English has its own genius and its own kind of comfort. So, for instance, translating Rilke, the verse is formal, gorgeous formal verse, a lot of it in iambic pentameter and closely rhymed. The closest we have to it is maybe the poetry of Yeats. And when I re-emerged into English, my ear wanted it to be formal verse, but a more fluid line, not a strict iambic pentameter, but something that sounds like iambic pentameter, but something more fluid. And the rhymes to my ear in 1980 or 81, sounded too heavy, and so I was using off-rhyme to give readers a sense of what that formal gorgeousness sounds like, but not to be so heavy that it would jar my ear and other readers' ears. In the Gita, to take another example, I've read a lot of versions. I've been told that there are 200 versions into English alone, and many of them are faithful in a literal sense. They're scholarly, they're dependable, they're usable, and each of them will give you something valuable. But my sense was that none of them had any life in their words because they weren't being recreated as poetry in English. And the majesty and the power of the Gita in Sanskrit, to the extent that I can hear it, is this wonderful, sinuous, subtle, powerful, beautiful verse. That's our nearest equivalent in the West is classical Greek and Latin verse, that kind of movement of a line. And so I recreated it in a line that has that dignity of formal verse and yet is fluid and conversational enough to sound like a human being talking to another human being about what is most precious and valuable that he has seen, not as some sacred text talking a an out-of-date sacred language. So really, even more important than the content, than the literal meaning, what I want to do is to convey a sense of the soul singing, the essence of that poet as embodied in his music. And that to me is a deeper kind of faithfulness than a literal faithfulness. That's what the Gita, I'm calling the Gita a translation because I've kept somewhat close to the text, except if I felt that it needed an explanation or an expansion. And one of the lines that I read before, I have something like, at the end of a cosmic cycle, 150,000 billion of your earthly years. That figure is added. The Sanskrit word means something like cosmic cycle, but I felt that to a Western mind it would give no idea of these amazing figures in Indian thinking that just rocket the rational mind out of its comfortable little world. And it's astonishing to hear these numbers. And there are a number of other instances where I've done that in the Gita. In the Tao Te Ching, I didn't call it a translation, I called it a version. And sometimes I'm rather literal, or as literal as a person can be with this Rorschach test of all sacred texts. And sometimes I'm absolutely free and absolutely unfaithful to the literal meaning. As a matter of fact, in 7 or 8 chapters, I've thrown the literal meaning out the window entirely, because I felt that those chapters were coming from a much less deep sense of awareness than the rest of the book, and might even have been written by another author. So what I did in those chapters was improvised on the same theme that the original chapter was written on, and I have those documented in my notes, so I didn't mean to try to get away with anything. I did have great fun doing them, though. And I am tickled when sometimes after a reading of the Tao Te Ching, somebody comes up to me and says, I have to tell you, my favorite chapter is chapter 50, and starts to quote it, and that is absolutely improvised. So that gives me a kind of mischievous pleasure. Yes?
I think Gita has several messages, and one of the messages where this war is justified is by Krishna saying that your duty and doing the right thing is supersedes any act you do. And he also says that, he also preaches somehow that even if you have to fight this war, but do this war thinking of me, so that's your duty. And if I go back into the history, as you said, Gandhi was one of the followers, and I think that another close example comes is of Abraham Lincoln. When I read about his biography, when his sister-in-law came home with 2 kids, because his brother-in-law was killed in the war fighting his army, he stayed home and cried for 2-3 days with her. The war came home to him, but to him the cause which he was fighting was more than the love of the people who were being killed. And that was a very parallel of what he did is what Krishna is asking Arjuna to do, that although they are your relatives, although you care for them, or you love them, but there is evil in them, and it's your duty and it's the right thing to do to go and fight them. And
Yes.
that's how that battle is justified.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And as I said, that cannot be the attitude of somebody who has seen the truth. In every war in history, each side thinks it's right. Hitler's soldiers thought it was a just war as well. And who's to say what the absolute perspective is? In every war, it's always God on my side, and this is what leads to war. Everyone thinks he's right. So even if Krishna calls this a just war and says that Arjuna ought to fight, I'm not convinced. Thoreau also, who's one of the early admirers, along with Emerson of the Gita, the early admirers in America, was not convinced by that line of reasoning and loved the poem and thought it was far greater than our own spiritual text, and even greater than Shakespeare, he thought, which is saying a lot for Thoreau. So this whole way of thinking, this is a just war, I am a good man, my opponent is an evil man, is crazy, literally crazy, an insane way of thinking from the point of view of the sage, as he's portrayed later on in the Bhagavad Gita. A sage cannot view anyone as evil because everyone is the self. Everyone is a reflection of the self. And so even as Krishna says, a heartless criminal, somebody who's murdered and raped and, pillaged and whatever, has in the center of his heart the absolute truth, the absolute God seated in the center of his heart. And the natural attitude of a sage is to connect with that place in him, to see that he's simply misguided, he's confused, and that if he could hang out in the presence of truth, even for a little bit, that his life could be completely turned around. It's not appropriate to go in and take a sword and lop off his head. It's not possible for a man coming from that place of devotion. Not possible. Somebody in back.
Picking up on that last question, what then would be the reason for taking up a sword or a weapon against, Hitler's troops? What would be the defining reason that would make the warrior then a tool?
I said before that I could imagine even a Buddha enlisting, and I suppose the reason that a Buddha might have would be to prevent more death. But in connection with that, let me read you that chapter from the Tao Te Ching, which I feel contains a most mature attitude towards any kind of conflict and violence, even something that has to happen. So it goes like this: weapons are the tools of fear. A decent man will avoid them except in the direst necessity, and if compelled, will use them only with the utmost restraint. Peace is his highest value. If the peace has been shattered, how can he be content? His enemies are not demons, but human beings like himself. He doesn't wish them personal harm, nor does he rejoice in victory. How could he rejoice in victory and delight in the slaughter of men? He enters a battle gravely, with sorrow and with great compassion, as if he were attending a funeral. Yes.
I agree with you 100% that a true master would never espouse the cause of violence. And I really appreciate the work you have done. I embrace the fact that you have always tried to come from a place of understanding of the heart rather than understanding of the mind. And I'm wondering, what next? What's your next step?
Well, I've been writing fiction in the last few years. There's a book called Meetings with the Archangel, and there's another book called The Frog Prince, which came out last year and is now being made into a musical comedy, which is gives me a big kick to think of my frog standing on a Broadway stage serenading the princess. It's just wonderful icing on the cake. And so I will be writing more fiction, but the next book is a book that I'm helping someone to write, a woman named Byron Katie. I don't know if any of you have heard of her, but she is someone who had a profound awakening experience 15 years ago, maybe the most profound that I've ever heard of. And at the time of her awakening was given a method that is simple, powerful, American, amazing, to end human suffering. And it's a method of self-realization that she calls the work. And I am very honored to be involved in that book. I'm kind of the midwife for it. It will be out next year. And those of you who are interested and have access to the internet can find her website at www.thework.org. And it's really, her story is an amazing story. It's the story of a woman coming from total confusion and total despair, and all of a sudden, one morning on the floor of a halfway house, opening her eyes and no longer being there. It opened her eyes. It saw a cockroach crawling across her ankle. It stood up. It laughed from the depths of the universe. And the state of joy that was present then has been present uninterruptedly ever since. And the power of this simple method of investigation is extraordinary. I've seen it transform people in the space of a half hour. So that's what I'm doing next. Well, thank you for coming. I'll be glad to sign books if any of you want.